Hello and welcome to today's Global Conversation in Literacy with Dr. Guy Merchant. Your moderators for today are Dr. Peggy Albers, Professor of Language and Literacy at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia, USA, and me, Cindy Fujimoto, a Language and Literacy doctoral student at Georgia State University. Other GCLR team members include Miang-Lung Pang, Tuba Angai Crowder, Ji-Hei Shin, Sarah Turnbull, Mandy Sina, and Juan Wang, all doctoral students at Georgia State University. Jin Zhang, doctoral student at Penn, and Dr. Christy Pace, part-time instructor at Georgia State University. Global Conversations in Literacy Research has provided professional development to approximately 30,000 people through its live and archived seminars and has reached people in over 160 countries across the world. GCLR is an active research project that attempts to understand professional development and learning in online spaces. If you wish not to be involved, please type your name in the chat area. The collected data will provide important information for understanding the nature of web seminars to share scholarship across the world. All data is anonymous. During today's web seminar, if you have any comments or questions, please type them into the chat box and Dr. Merchant will address these at the end of the presentation. We would love to know from where you are participating in today's web seminar, so please use the wand tool and click your location on the map. Dr. Guy Merchant is a professor in literacy education, research excellence framework coordinator, and research lead for the Department of Teacher Education at Sheffield Hallam University, United Kingdom. Dr. Merchant specializes in research in digital literacy and is particularly interested in the interrelations between children and young people, new technology, and literacy. Dr. Merchant is a former convener for the United Kingdom Literacy Association and a member of the association's Executive Committee and National Council. He has been a core group member of numerous Economic and Social Research Council-funded seminars and recently directed Children and Young People's Digital Literacies in Virtual Online Spaces. Dr. Merchant is the author and/or editor of many articles and books, including New Literacies Across the Globe, Virtual Literacies, Interactive Spaces for Children and Young People, and Web 2.0 for Schools, Social Participation and Learning. Please look for his newest publication, available in the autumn of 2016, Learning Media and Technology, Past, Present, Future, edited by Kathy Barnett, Becky Perry, and Guy Merchant, and published by Bloomsbury Press. Dr. Merchant is the founding editor of the Journal of Early Childhood Literacy, a member of the editorial board of Literacy, and serves on the Student Dissertation Committee of the International Literacy Association. He's also active in literacy education and professional work, including writing curriculum materials and professional publications. Dr. Merchant blogs about subjects related to literacy, technology, and education. Visit his academic blog at http://myvedana.blogspot.com. At this time, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Merchant and his presentation entitled New Mobile Literacies.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear and see me to the best of their abilities. Thank you very much for that introduction, and many thanks for inviting me to give this talk. It's a great honor, a great privilege, and a great opportunity to explore my current thinking on what I'm calling, for now at least, new mobile literacies. So thank you for joining this session. A couple of things before I really get started. First of all, I wanted to express my gratitude to a number of people who've been extremely influential in my thinking. and the examples as well that I'll be sharing. This presentation is as much theirs as it is mine. I want to start with my principal collaborator, Kathy Burnett, who continues to push my thinking, rephrase my clumsy sentences and so on. And then in no particular order, except for the fact it's alphabetical, Karen Daniels, Jackie Marsh, Richard Poutney, Dylan Yamada Rice, and Roberta Taylor, and there are many others. And the second thing that I want to do now is just to reflect for a moment on this particular event, because it is relevant. Well, these virtual environments are now relatively stable. Our devices are good enough, and our broadband connectivity generally strong enough to hold up. But all this is relatively recent. It was not the case a few years back, but it ushers in a sort of time-space compression in which we can assemble translocally with, around and through our devices, and so be in communication. There is a movement, a mobility in this, even though the nature of a talk usually requires us to be sedentary. So, mobile literacies. The words conjure up the idea of making meaning on the move. And as my good friend and colleague in Canada, Christian Arett, suggests, this mobility is associated in the public cultural imaginary with urban youth. Or to be more specific, it's about urban youth with smartphones, with cell phones, mobiles, or whatever you choose to call them. And this is perhaps because they are visible, because they're young, and maybe because we're supposed to teach them something or other. But meaning making on the move, these mobile literacies could equally apply to different segments of the population, particularly with the rise of urbanism. And if it seems to us then that literacies have taken flight with new technologies, we should also consider where they haven't taken flight. We should ask, what are the new asymmetries of communication? Where are the new divisions and inequalities, and how do these interface with the historic ones that still pattern the present? Despite what we call global reach, new technologies certainly are far from universal. Recent notions, such as Mastin Prinsloo's idea of placed resources and Macfarlane's idea of translocal assemblages, trouble the flatness or certainty of any notions of a globalized digital revolution. Those of us working in new literacies have visibly aged under the obligation to stay current, to be alert to the very newest of new literacies. And we've often tried to catch the butterfly of the new as it moves. And in pinning it, we've often stopped that moment, freezing it in midair. Perhaps it is the same with any commentary, any description, or any analysis of human communication. It tends to offer us a single perspective on a phenomenon that is restless, creative, and perhaps as diverse as its users. And as I say those words, new literacies, I imagine a future in which one might wander in a scrapyard of old signs, as one can in the boneyard of Las Vegas. Here they spell out the words we've used: multi-literacies, digital literacies, critical digital literacies, multimodal literacies, virtual literacies, oh yes, and this one, mobile literacies. So quickly, before it rusts, what might this one do for us? What might mobile literacies conjure up? Or perhaps mobility. Let's start there. Mobility is one of those signature themes of the 21st century. On a macro scale, we're preoccupied with the movement of people, whether it takes the form of the migrant crisis that has tested Europe's ability to act with humanity, the contagion and spread of Ebola that has troubled the medical community, illegal border crossings and their generational legacy, or the carbon footprint left by mass tourism and big business. Within liberal democracies, we agonise about social mobility, about the rising gap between rich and poor. At a local level, at the ability of the transport infrastructure to get people from A to B. And with our growing sensitivity to disability and ageing, how access and mobility can be enhanced. And so the sociologist John Urry here provides a sort of taxonomy of mobilities, what he calls interdependent mobilities. None of these are exactly new to the 21st century, but a concept of mobilities sensitizes us to how we might put ourselves about, how we get around, who moves where, how we communicate, and how. So how do any of these instances of mobility connect with our idea of literacies? Perhaps the answer lies in something that's always intrigued me, the other dictionary definition of communication. It's the second in my concise Oxford, in which communication is seen as a means of, I missed that typo, as a means of connecting different places, such as a door, passage, road, or railway. And communication, by whichever definition, always implies a sort of movement, a movement of people, things, or ideas. Yes, a mobility. And if this holds true, we could argue that all literacies are in some ways mobile. And if that is the case, no need to go on, except, of course, as I suggested at the beginning, we have to acknowledge that we see rather a lot of people wandering about holding these things, these rectangular objects of different sizes, talking to them, tapping them, running their fingers over them as if they were so many pets. Maybe you do the same, temporarily stashing a phone in your back pocket as you walk along, or rummaging around in the dark recesses of a bag to locate the pulsing of an incoming call. Let's turn first to the devices themselves, the mobile devices. What are they? Well, of course, they're all of these things at one time or another, and really, they are all over us. Literally all over us, particularly as they become wearable. So I have this picture from the UK in 2011, when the device of preference did seem to be the BlackBerry. It charts some of the uses to which those technologies were put at the time, 2011, and now on to 2015, only 4 years later, and here again the statistics, 66% of adults using a smartphone on a daily basis, 19% of 16 to 24-year-olds owning one, and people spending twice as long on a mobile device than on a laptop or a desktop. And finally, of course, that adult users clock up 2 hours a day, not as much as they do on televisions in the UK, interestingly, but still on the rise. And we get a similar picture from North America and from elsewhere where we collect the statistics. So that's a familiar picture, and we see that what is mobile is both us, our bodies, our devices, our networks, the traces we leave, and the meanings we make as we update, as we message, as we tweet, as we Snapchat, or whatever. that mobility is a flow of things, a flow of people, ideas and resources, discourses that assembles in different ways at different times. And I feel unable to give any talk at all without some quote from Kenneth Gergen, and in this one he conjures up the idea that the mobile phone, the material object that we look at, becomes a signal, a sign of a significant nucleus, as he says, stretching out in all directions, amorphous and protean. So my approach in what follows draws on a variety of different traditions. I'm inspired by the work of Latour and Law, what might be called after-actor network theory, from post-phenomenology, and from new materialism. And these two quotations really signal to me, first of all, in the Latour quotation, how humans and their non-human devices, if you like, are hopelessly entangled together. There is no point, no reason in separating them out. And Ide, quote, who's a post-phenomenologist, actually underlines exactly the same phenomenon. So bear this in mind as I offer commentary on 5 or 6 examples of what I refer to as new mobile literacies, different instances of how the mobile assembles itself. So I'm going to begin with mobile babies, perhaps the logical place to start, but also a very interesting place to start, not least because mobility is a bit of a challenge for the newborn. Good babies are born digital, and that digital signature is a mobile one, and it often begins before the baby is actually born, as prenatal scans get circulated on mobile devices, on social networking sites. And not only that, babies pretty soon set to work as their wont, levering themselves up to interact with what is put in front of them. And quite often these days, what they interact with is itself mobile and digital, such as this interactive digital toy which attaches and detaches from the VTech baby walker, itself a device to encourage a different sort of mobility. It's part of a range of ELPs. By that I mean electronic learning products, distributed to supermarkets and toy stores in 84 countries by the Hong Kong-based company, VTech. Let's have fun together, it sings, as it lights up. It's a toy, a pedagogical toy, a literacy toy, and it's a mobile device for the not yet fully mobile. And it takes its place alongside the apps that are providing mobile literacies to the very young, such as the endless alphabet. Endless perhaps because it pushes new words to you. Words that you move around the screen to sound out and spell. Who needs magnetic letters, or all those routines of phonic instruction, if our young enter our early years settings with letters at their fingertips? And the quote here on this slide is from the CEO of Callaway Arts, the startup that designed this app. And if literacy might start looking different from the very earliest of stages, what about something a bit more familiar, like story sharing. So here we look at mobile toddlers. Are we being touched by a different sort of literacy? I'm drawing here from some collaborative work, Jackie Marsh, Karen Daniels and Dylan Yamada Rice. And in doing so, I'm evoking some propositions alluded to earlier on. That mobile practices are firstly place-based confluences of ideas, knowledge, practices and materials across sites. And that iPad literacies, or mobile literacies in this talk, are material instantiations of wider discursive practices. And that technologies both shape and are shaped by physical actions, meaning-making and representations. Our observations showed that taken for granted ideas, that touchscreen tablets are easy to handle, intuitive, portable, didn't always hold up. Adapting the multimodal analysis used by my colleague Roberta Taylor, I looked at some of the story sharing episodes. I detailed speech terms, including those taken by the so-called non-humans, the app, bodily movements, particularly proxemics and gesture, and reactants, to borrow that phrase from the early work of Latour. And that enabled me to capture the detail of something that looked rather like familiar story sharing routines, at least in some cases. In other cases, there was a sort of anarchy of slapping and tapping. But as you can see, there is something about holding, something about pointing, something about tapping and swiping that is highly relevant to the study of mobile literacies. And work in this vein has continued in the work of Jackie Marsh and Dylan Yamada Rice in the TAP project. iPads also featured in the Digital Futures project as elementary pupils worked on Hockney-style flowers. Here, Kate Cosgrove's children at work. Here you can see some of the flowers they produced. And here you can see the choreography of bodies, hands and devices, and how that assembles amongst the tables, the boxes, the uniforms of her classroom. And in the children's blog posts, that last one at the bottom of your screen, on a now familiar theme, the touchscreen interface. And if the classroom was the place for these mobile devices, Rob Hobson's work was, in some senses, in this project, out there, laying the trail of a science fiction story in a local park using QR codes. So this shows the trail that the children set in the park. And as I looked back preparing for today's session at some video footage of this, what struck me was the intense physical mobility as children ran chaotically at full pelt across that park, mobile devices held precariously in their hands as they went from one hotspot to another. Another video from that project shows something a little bit more familiar. It's the popular newscast. Is it a genre? A popular newscast, the broadcast of the children's work in that park. Easy, so easy now to enact with cheap and available technology, video cameras, green screens and so forth, and very easily contained in the classroom space. So what happens when we break from this? Let's look at a story. In some ways, it's a tragic story, the story of a school that burnt down. But please note that no children or animals were hurt in this story. The fire authorities concluded that an electrical fault caused the fire at Camps Mount. And this is the story of schools without walls. So the fire blazed all night as the school burnt to so many cinders. And that tragic event prompted the school staff to work with the community to create a sort of mobile school out of web-based resources and pop-up classrooms in any spare room that they could get their hands on. The school was pushed to make use of technology on the move, with a school population and a school staff that was also on the move. Now, I don't advocate arson, please don't get me wrong, but I do think that this is a provocation. It makes us think about mobility and school spaces in a new way. And also, as you read through the response to the aftermath of the fire, you get a sense of really what this provoked in the school staff and the community who were involved. And you can also read about youth and their repeated dissatisfaction with the school system, as they all wished at some point that the school would burn down. But when it did, to quote, "the fucking irony." So one of the things that came out of the Camps Mount project were some fairly straightforward pieces of learning for the teachers. That they could use mobile devices for doing some fairly straightforward things, such as photographing notes, presentations, capturing experiments and activities, the sort of things that you can't take away from the classroom project. They could also have fairly immediate, but also fairly durable responses to learning tasks. I seem to have caught up on a rather awkward phrase of mobile desk referencing, but kids were able to use mobile devices, as many adults do, to simply Google or search for the next piece of information. And there's also a more everyday sense in which we could use the mobile in order to navigate our way around different locations, different timetables, and different headlines. So perhaps there's a sort of dialogue, a dialogue between mobile literacies in the wild and how we might start to think of them in school contexts. And so this last, and this older story, illustrates something else. It illustrates that sort of dialogue where we can think up the possibilities of different kinds of learning relationships. But we know that classrooms, schools are part of institutions, and they're patterned by established relationships, formal ways of working, accepted school practices, instructional routines, what might be referred to as bundles of practices. What happens when we break with those? This is an older story, which illustrates how Paul Haig, an assistant head teacher, dared to wonder why students were banned from using their mobiles in school. And it decided to turn that around, to experiment with what might happen if they were welcome. And he hit the headlines. It was almost as if he'd opened a lesion in the body politic. Here's a reaction. Yes, Paul, an experiment. Tinker enough with this country's children's education and you end up with morons. Exactly what the lefties want. And of course, in suing this, the press took their familiar positions on the battleground. So perhaps we could say that when people, ideas and things assemble in certain ways, they easily draw in wider discourses, the so-called bigger issues. And this is where we must go now, not, I hasten to add, to the headline quote from the Daily Mail, which I'm sure we don't quite sign up to, but towards looking at, if you like, the bigger picture of mobile literacies. So here, in winding up, I want to look at some of the characteristics of 21st century literacies. They're now well rehearsed in many lists, and here are some of them. But I do refer you to a forthcoming column in the Journal of Adult and Adolescent Literacy by Kathy Burnett and me for more on the challenge of 21st century literacies. But some of these features of new mobile literacies, of 21st century literacies, are very much in evidence in our lives. We have then been pondering what happens in everyday life and what happens in the lives of those that we're charged to educate. We might observe that mobiles are like this, that they're used for maintaining our connection with our friends and our family members. They're used for casual entertainment. They're used for arranging meetings, for what has been called micro-coordination, and of course for capturing objects and events, significant ones, humorous ones, and so forth. And of course for that ubiquitous habit of checking for information. All these are there, but it's almost as if literacies are always in flux. We can always find new ways to put our devices to use. So this I captured last year in Nepal, which is using an iPad in liturgical practice. And here we see how different affinities come into play, different ways in which people band together around mobiles. Some of these ways are often celebrated, but that seems to be perhaps a very simplistic way of viewing the world. Because mobile literacies present us with as many challenges as opportunities. Many of you will remember Howard Rheingold's book entitled Smart Mobs and all the enthusiasm, I think, with which that was greeted. These phenomena are often celebrated by people who write about technology, celebrated by those in the new literacies. But of course it's not always like that. So these are two images from the civil disturbances, the riots in the UK in the 6th of August 2011, following the police shooting of Mark Duggan. Well, of course, mobile technologies were not responsible for this incident. Things are far more complex than that. But nevertheless, research into that outbreak of civil disturbance, which found across the nation, shows that the encrypted nature of BlackBerry Messenger, BBM, as was used at the time, enabled those responsible for these civil disturbances to outwit the police at every stage. In other words, to move into different places at different times. So we might begin this work of looking at new mobile literacies by exploring what maps onto school, where mobiles fit with classrooms, where they challenge classroom ethos, and how we think about education in an era in which YouTube tutorials teach more effectively than teachers, in an era in which many students might prefer to be a YouTube celebrity than a teacher. And on this slide, I just began a quick mapping of those sorts of things. So if there were 5 characteristics of what we use mobile devices for, new mobile literacies for in everyday life, there are 5 approximate uses in school environments. But maybe the discussion needs to be more wide-ranging than that. It needs to stretch into potentialities for education, potentialities of new kinds of literacies. As Kevin Leander and his colleagues pointed out in 2010, if mobilities are new in some fashion, then part of this newness is conceived of in relation to something familiar and conventional, the classroom. And so there's an irony. The irony in many of our examples, and in the examples I've used, is that in contrast to everyday mobile practices, the use of mobile devices in classrooms tends to be fairly static. It turns into a new form of desk work. It might actually begin to look like new wine in old bottles. So I want to round up, and I want to round up with 3 concerns and 3 questions for you. And clearly throughout the talk, I've signalled many more concerns, many more issues, but this set really come to the top of the pile for me. So it's an old question, but I think it's a question that's well worth asking. Is the fact that we can do new things, do different things with mobile devices, sufficient justification for adopting them in schools, in classrooms? At its harshest, the question is, what advantages do they confer? The second question, I think, is perhaps the hardest question of all, partly because teachers themselves are embedded in institutions and are part of and reproduced by routines held in place, of course, by curricula and accountability. But how do or how can teachers develop pedagogies that capitalise on the affordances of mobile devices? And perhaps to prefigure any questions that you might have on the whole issue of bringing your own devices. I wonder which students have devices that are sufficiently nimble. And there are questions of who owns them and who pays the bills for them. And underneath this question, of course, some real concerns about new issues of social capital. New issues that you might say rotate around digital capital. And so, for my final three questions, I think the first of these applies to all instances of new literacies. And I know Sonia Livingstone is always saying we can't say that we leave the issues of internet safety for someone else to discuss. They are part and parcel, they're integral to any discussion. And the question is, how can we use new mobile literacies in ways that, to borrow the words from Christine Greenhow, are legal, safe, ethical, and of course advantageous in children's and in students' lives. And secondly, how can we work effectively to ensure that new technologies do not magnify existing social inequalities or indeed reproduce, as I said at the beginning, historic social inequalities? And finally, I think an issue that very often gets neglected. I've just begun to work on a new book project which may well have the word iPad in the title, and an attempt to grapple with this last question. How indeed can we raise children's, students' awareness of the global corporate interests that are at play in our new mobile literacies? So at that point, I'm going to draw a line under this session and open up to any discussion or questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Professor Merchant, thank you for your insightful and engaging presentation. We will now invite Professor Merchant to respond to the questions that you have generated across the presentation. Please continue to type your questions in this Q&A session facilitated by Dr. Albers.
Thank you, Professor Merchant, for that engaging and very interesting presentation. And it certainly generated a large number of questions and comments throughout the chat. And we're going to start with actually one of the questions that you posed at the end of your seminar that was raised in our chat area, and that is, the BBC reported that by the end of this year, over half of the global population will be connected. How do we best address these digital inequalities across the globe?
It's a great question, and it feels more than I can attempt to answer in this one. I mean, I'm acutely aware of these, and when you look around in this field, reading press reports, it's very easy for us to talk about the global, and some of my work has addressed this, but let's not forget that there are areas of the world in which access is very much restricted. What you say in some jurisdictions is heavily censored. What you access in some jurisdictions is extremely limited. How we address it is a really difficult question, but I do believe that we have an opportunity for, if you like, reaching out, communicating with people in different places. And sometimes I fear that our discussions are rather limited. Very much in this field, we tend to talk within the English, Anglo-dominant communities of North America, England, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. And I think there's a lot to be done. I know colleagues in this country, and I know some of the work headed up by Glinda Hull has done a great job in connecting communities across the globe. And I'd like to see more of that happening. Whether that addresses inequities or not, it certainly raises awareness. And I think that's perhaps the best we can do, at least for now.
Thank you very much for that response. We have another question from one of our audience members who says, if literacies have always been mobile, then what do new technologies really add?
It's another great question, and it's a question that I'm always asking myself. In some ways, I suppose at one level, one has to say that literacies, in a way, don't change that fast. In a way, they've always been used to connect people. That's their history. It's just that they've got more sophisticated, and they've got more sophisticated more quickly. So I'll use an example from my good friend and colleague at Lancaster, Julia Gillen. Please do read her work on postcards. So she's been studying Victorian Edwardian postcards at the turn of the last century. And some really interesting things come across from that. One is that the postcard was the social networking of the day. The other thing is that people at the time believed that their communication was, actually use the word, instantaneous, because it was then possible to send a postcard when you were at work and for the postcard to arrive home before you did. Such was the sophistication of the postal service. So in some ways, we've always used literacies in the same ways to connect across time and space. But I think what I see happening, and that's why I was drawing attention to this, to some of the affordances of this virtual environment that we're in at the moment, in some ways, that's all become speeded up. So we've got that same time-space compression, but it's now a hell of a lot more sophisticated. So it's almost as if we're doing the same things, but we're now able to do them in a much more sophisticated way. So things are changing. Maybe they're not changing quite so fundamentally as we sometimes think. I hope that's a good answer to the question, but I think the question is one really that I'd like to throw back in a sense to the questioner. Let's keep on asking that question. What's changing? How's it changing? What's different? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Merchant. One of our audience members asks, our pre-service Bachelor of Education program is a bring-your-own-device classroom, and they often collaborate on best practices in the classroom with digital technologies. Often their questions are about the disconnect between what we are learning in their program and what is available and used in the classroom. Do you have any further suggestions for rethinking school spaces with mobile literacies?
First of all, let me just say how envious I think some of my colleagues would be hearing about the program you describe. For here in England, our teacher preparation programs are so constrained that very often our student teachers wouldn't get much further than how to deliver the latest phonics program and maybe a couple of one-hour lectures on what digital literacy might afford. So these trainee teachers are in a very privileged position, I think. But I have thought for some time really the bulk of my empirical work and thinking has been about schools, school children and technology. But I also do work in a university, and universities, not always, but universities have got some very sophisticated technologies up and running. Certainly in my institution, use of mobiles is in a sense so normal, and I know from when I've been elsewhere in the States and in other places as well, it's just kind of like normal to see devices being used as you talk and interact with people. Schools are far behind that, or most schools are far behind that, and that is actually a resource issue as well as everything else. So it's a very difficult question to answer because many school systems are highly constrained in what they're allowed to do through curriculum accountability measures, but also what's possible to do because of the devices that they can afford to resource. There are some wonderful exceptions. I'd like to point to the Future Schools project in Singapore, where we've got one-to-one computing with tablets which are provided by the school, and they cross the homeschool boundary in the opposite direction to the one that we normally think about. So that, for me, would be an ideal model, but it's an expensive model. So I think we've got to start forging new partnerships, and they may have to be partnerships with industry, with the manufacturers of devices, so that we can get the kind of resources into schools that both the students themselves would want, perhaps the teachers would want, I hope the teachers would want, and of course future employers would want. I think we've got to solve this one, and we've got to solve it quite quickly because technology is of course rapidly developing. And the scenario I encounter very often when I speak with teachers is that they're forced to use devices that are out of date with old software and a whole host of problems, which actually end up being a disincentive. So I'm sorry if there aren't very many rays of hope there, but I think we've got to keep on pushing against this. And I think there are actually some systemic issues here that if our governments, our educational authorities are really keen to provide a 21st century experience for students, an up-to-date experience, there's got to be some resourcing of classrooms. One class set, 25, 30 iPads or iPods is not going to solve issues in a large school, particularly as those machines, get old, get lost, and their batteries give out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Merchant. I think we have time for one more question. And this has been a question that's been cutting across the chat today, and that is, so many educators are concerned about aspects of current literacies that are being missed out. For example, when people chat or when they iMessage, the spelling and the grammar and how mobile communication has shifted how and what young children, adolescents communicate. And some educators are concerned about the fact that children are developing different kinds of literacies that might not be as traditional as one might expect. How do we shift the mindset of those in power to make decisions about education, access, and the possibilities of mobile communications that somehow address these quote-unquote missed out literacies, if that makes sense?
It makes complete sense, and I think it is the burning question. So in building here from where I'm based in Sheffield, the idea of a charter for 21st century literacies, which really is the centerpiece of the most recent book that you very kindly publicised at the beginning, New Literacies Across the Globe. We've been trying to work on exactly that. So again, you know, that article up and coming, the Journal of Adult and Adolescent Literacies, the Challenging 21st Century Literacies, is just an attempt to really push this debate centre stage. If we really do want something that equips children and students for their day-to-day living in the 21st century, and of course for their future prospects, then something's got to shift pretty quickly. Yeah, of course, there are those basic literacy skills. They're still really important. But as I think some of my examples showed, even they're beginning to look a bit different as they become mobile. But very few school systems seem able to really deliver what is current, the sort of practices that most of us actually engage in quite fluently. So there really has to be a real concerted attempt by all of us to begin to press on policymakers and to press on perhaps what is perhaps a simplified version of some of the discussions that we've been having today. And that really was the idea that Kathy Brennett and I came up with, of the idea of a charter for 21st century literacies. It isn't perfect, but how can we develop something, you know, on a sheet of A4, to be very traditional about things, on a sheet of paper that you could push into people's hands and say, hey, look, literacy's got to look a bit more like this. I think it's an uphill struggle. That's how it seems at the moment, but I think it's a cause worth rallying around and worth fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Merchant, for responding to those questions. We really appreciate that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Cindy Fujimoto, our host.